Hunting boots are a critical component of any successful hunt. Whether walking a short distance to your blind or trudging miles through rugged terrain, your feet are carrying the load. Without the right boots, you could give up early and lose out on that trophy just over the ridge. At Midway USA, we make selecting boots for your next hunt easier. With just a few clicks of a mouse, you can decide on what's important, like waterproofing, insulation, size, width, and savings. For just about everything for shooting, hunting, and the outdoors, check out MidwayUSA.com. The 1911 is one of the most iconic firearms in history. Designed by John Browning, the 1911 was the standard issue sidearm of the U.S. military from 1911 to 1985. While Colt produced the original, almost every major firearm company has produced its own version. It's wildly revered for its reliability, crisp trigger, and is still a favorite for all types of shooters. Whether you're looking to buy or build a 1911 and just about everything for guns, log on to MidwayUSA.com.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of CastingAcross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Well, today we're talking about one of my and one of your favorite topics when it comes to fly fishing, and that is fly rods. Now, yes, there's a lot more to fly fishing about gear, but you can't do fly fishing without gear, and one of the most essential pieces of gear, one of the most beautiful pieces of gear, is the fly rod. Now, to be honest, fly line is actually much more integral in making fly fishing what it is. But of course, you're not going to really want to throw fly line unless you have a fly rod. And that fly rod is a lot more beautiful to look at. It's a lot more fun to touch. It's a lot more fun to shop for than fly line. And even though I'm a huge fan of good fly line, I have to admit that I like fly rods a whole lot more. And fly rods, of course, are an integral part of the aesthetic aspect of fly fishing, both when you're on the water, when you're thinking about it. It's going to be in logos. It's going to be on display. It's going to be the first thing that your eyes go towards when you are looking at gear, and it's going to be the focal point of any fly shop. So fly rods are good. Fly rods are fun. And although fly rods aren't the end of fly fishing, they are an important part of that journey to fly fishing enjoyment. And so if your fly rod is very modest or if your fly rod is very fancy, it is an important part of what you do. And I've liked talking about fly rods, both for the 280 plus episodes of the podcast. I've talked about it quite a bit, and the thousands of articles over on castingacross.com over the last 8 years. But I also think that I'm mildly qualified to talk about fly rods. One reason being I've been dealing with them and using them for teaching, selling them, and talking about them for 25 years now. My very first job, I worked at a fly shop. My very first real job, worked at a fly shop. And actually, take that back. I worked at a contact lens company, but that's another story. My first fly fishing job, how about that, was at a fly shop. And when things were slow, I would take different rods out. And one of my favorite things to do, to really feel like I could be able to explain things to customers and talk to people about the fly rods that we had and that they could be buying, was to take out two very similar fly rods. What was the difference between the 8-foot 5-weight in graphite and the 8-foot 5-weight in fiberglass? What was different between the 9-foot 5-weight that had the fast action and the 9-foot 5-weight that had the medium action? What was the difference, really between the 9-weight and the 8-weight? What did that feel like on the cast? We know, the species and things like that, but and the cast, what did that actually feel like? And so that was one of the things I really decided that I wanted to get a feel for. And then I wanted to pursue casting for the purpose of teaching other people to cast. I enjoyed learning how to cast for accuracy and for distance, but then to be able to break it down so I could share those component parts with other people to try to help them diagnose where they had deficiencies, not for the sake of having a textbook perfect cast, but the better you are on your fundamentals, the better you are under adverse circumstances, and the better that you are at casting over time. So even though you might be throwing, 30-foot casts to fish that are willing to have you a little bit sloppy in your presentation, it'd be better for when you do have to make that 40-foot cast, or when that fish decides to be a little bit more finicky, to make a better 30-foot cast. So a lot of time selling rods, a lot of time casting, teaching casting, learning casting, and a lot of time buying fly rods, to be honest with you. So to that end, along with just the here and there articles and podcasts about fly rods, something I've been putting together for a few months now, I think going back to late last year on Casting Across, is a page called Fly Rod FAQs, so frequently asked questions about fly rods. And I think I've put out 3 of these articles, and a lot of the content is, of course, rehashes of things I've talked about in one way, shape, or form elsewhere on Casting Across in the medium of either the podcast or on the website. But I wanted to have a catalog of questions and answers and to keep them short, to keep them brief. And what's the reason for that? Well, it's not because I think my 3-sentence answer to a question is going to be the end all be all of your particular inquiry about a fly rod. But what I wanted to provide was just a short, pithy response to someone who might be a listener or a reader, so has a little bit of trust in what I say, of just kind of my general perspective. And then, of course, there's plenty of other places on my website and on my podcast that you can ask those questions and answer those questions. And then, undoubtedly, there are so many resources out there, both from folks that kind of do what I do, people who are making fly rods, people who are testing fly rods, that are worth looking at. But I want to create kind of a catch-all for general questions and some very specific questions about fly rods. So that page is called Fly Rod FAQs. But I wanted to handle a handful of these on the podcast today. Reason being, they are short, pithy answers. I want to keep them within like 3 sentences. But I thought I would elaborate on a few of them today, but also encourage you to go check out that page. And I'll give some more information on where that can be found later in the podcast. For those of you who don't always stick around to the tail end, every week I share what happened that week on the website. There's always 2 articles of some kind, and this week I'll of course be touching on the most recent fly rod FAQ article, and included in that is the easiest way to get a hold of me to ask me a question directly on the website, which very well may roll into one of these articles, or it might pop up in a podcast episode because, of course, every 10 episodes I do fly fishing accusations, which is any of your questions, comments, accusations, or other feedback on fly fishing, something I've said or something that you're curious in. So without further ado, let me kind of dive right into it. It's a question I've heard a number of times from folks on the website and from people I fish with as they are getting started in fly fishing or trying to diversify their fly fishing, is this question: can I use a nymphing rod for other kinds of fly fishing? Can I use a nymphing rod for other kinds of fly fishing? So a nymphing rod, what is that? Well, technically any rod that you use to nymph is a nymphing rod, but more specifically, we're talking about that broad category of Euro nymphing. There's, of course, a number of different styles, varieties, and techniques, but essentially these are lightweight rods, so 2-weight, 3-weight, 4-weight, but they have a very thick butt section to compensate for the fact that they are probably something like 10, 11, 12, or 13 foot long, because essentially what you're trying to do is maintain that tight line between your rod tip and that fly. So instead of having a strike indicator, 30 feet out there and you're watching that bobber, here you have a direct line from the tip of your rod down to the fly. And there's a lot of things that are happening between your rod tip and your fly. There's different styles, materials, diameters, colors of tippet. There may be tippet rings, there may be weights, there may be multiple flies, and there may be all sorts of crazy knots. But that is kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about this morning. But that's essentially the kind of rod that we're talking about, rods that are specifically utilized for this kind of fly fishing. So what are these rods good for? These rods are very good for having sensitivity in that kind of application. These rods are very good for making long reaches, for moving a space that is somewhere between 6 to 8 feet in front of you, all the way out to maybe 20 feet in front of you, to making these tight line presentations. And they're also good for lobbing multi-nymph and weighted rigs from a downstream position to an upstream position. They are very good for those things, and they're good at also fighting fish. Longer rods are helpful for fighting fish. What they are not good for is making long casts with streamers. What they are not good for is making delicate presentations with dry flies. they're not good for those things. Oh, they're also really good for mending line, which, I mean, that's a plus. Any rod that makes mending line easier, moving that belly of the line as it swings downstream faster than the flies, and thus messing up their natural dead drift. Any rod that can make a mend is good. But like I said, you're not going to be able to throw a heavy fly on a line very, very far with a 11-foot 3-weight. It's not designed for it, and it has little to do with the fact that it's 11 feet, and it has little with the fact that it is a 3-weight. It has to do with the total overall build of the taper of that rod. Can you do it? Can you cast a 60-foot cast to a rising trout with a size 16 Adams on your 12-foot 4-weight? Yeah, I'm sure you could, but is it going to be pretty, and is it going to be easy? No. And is it going to be fun? Absolutely not. It's not what the rod is designed for. In a pinch, you can make it happen, but there's a lot of commitment that goes into Euro nymphing, not only with the rod, but then you have to think of, too, if you're truly using those nymphing tactics that you would use with that nymphing setup, then everything that you have coming out of that rod tip, and maybe even the line itself, is not going to be suited for casting. So I would say at the bare minimum, if you really, really are in a pinch, well, let me take that back. If you're really in a pinch and you see that fish that's rising, or you see that big fish that you know you want to cast a big heavy stream or two, then just do what you need to do, make it work, and count that as a one-off, count that as a abnormality, an anomaly for fishing with that nymphing rod. But if you really want to be diverse, then carry a second rod, and there's all sorts of options for that. If you're going to be using that nymphing rod 90% of the time, then have that either collapsible rod, you bring a tenkara rod for goodness sakes, but have that 6-piece rod that you can throw in a rod sock or a rod tube and strap to your pack. Or even what I like to do when I'm on bigger water is I carry a fully assembled, fully rigged second rod that is different enough from the rod I'm primarily fishing, and I pop that in a little contraption that I have, a rod holder on the back of my waders. And that gives me that flexibility. In fact, I rarely these days take a nymphing rod out if I'm going to be far from my car or I'm going to be fishing for a long time. I just don't like how I'm limited by it. It's an incredibly useful tool, great for fishing, catching probably more fish than any other style of fishing, just on average. But it is limiting, and ultimately you're not going to be casting very well with it in a traditional casting sense. So I would say, can you use an nymphing rod for other kinds of fly fishing? Yes. Should you? No. And if you want to argue, then I'm all happy to hear it. But that is my opinion. Another one: how much do I need to spend for a good rod? How much do I need to spend for a good rod? If you hop online today, you're going to see fly rods on Amazon and on Etsy and on any sort of big box website for under $75. And if you get onto the big fly fishing brand sites, you're going to see them at well over $1,000. It used to be that fly rods over $1,000 were really only in the realm of custom bamboo rods, but now those are even higher, and you can get most of the major brands have a graphite high-end rod for over $1,000. So people will balk at both sides of this equation. And I've talked about this a number of times. People get so upset. I can't believe they're making a fly rod for that amount of money. You have to remember, they wouldn't make it if people weren't buying it. And people buying it, they're using their money for what they want to use it for. Do I think it's necessarily wise for some people? No. Do I think it's good for other people? Absolutely. But people on the other end will say, yo, you should not fish with a fly rod that's $50 or $100 or $200. And I would say that's equally as ridiculous. I know a lot of people who fish with foam gripped plastic reel seated fly rods that catch a lot of fish and have a lot of fun doing it. So that's kind of more of the moral, the virtue, the ethical side of thinking about this question. But practically, how much do I need to spend for a good fly rod? Because I want to answer this question authentically and legitimately for people. And I will really say that I'd spend around $200. Okay. Can you get one for much cheaper? Of course. Can you get one for much more? Much, much, much more? Absolutely. But I would say that between $200 and $300 is that sweet spot for finding a really serviceable rod, something that's really going to do a lot of good work for you. And I would even go to the extent of saying you can get some extremely useful, good combos, rod reel line for between $200 and $300. You can get good ones for cheaper than that, and of course you can go much much higher than that. But that is about the sweet spot. $200 to $300, I would say, will get you a really good rod. Now, again, that is cheaper than a lot of golf clubs. That is cheaper than a lot of shotguns. That is cheaper than a lot of pairs of skis. So even though it might feel like a lot of money, it really is kind of, for better or for worse, where the cost of things are. You go to conventional gear now. You look at spinning rods and bait casting rods. Certainly, you look at surf casting rods and offshore rods. And $200 to $300 is not that ridiculous. And the technology has gotten such that what you're paying for a $200 $300 rod today is a much better rod than you would have been paying, maybe $500 for, even 20, 25 years ago. And they are good casting tools. I find that I accumulate more rods in this category than I do in the real high end, and I choose to go for rods in this category than the real low end stuff. And the reason for that is the blank components become very, very similar in a lot of rods when you get to that mid level. So the lower rods are going to have inferior blank components, so the rod itself, and the higher end rods are going to have, that's where you start to see companies be a little bit more experimental and potentially do a lot more stuff domestically. But really, where you see the difference between those low mid grade rod and the high mid grade rod is components. So the blank is going to be the same. The casting tool is going to be the same. You're just going to have some less expensive guides, a less expensive reel seat, which these days, people just throw on an anodized aluminum reel seat and call it good. And maybe a less expensive and fancy cork and some other bells and whistles. And that's okay. It's going to cast great. And really, that's what you want, especially if it's your second rod, third rod. It's your backup rod. It's the kind of rod that you have for this one particular situation. For example, the nymphing rod I was talking about a few minutes ago, that's where mine is. I don't have a super high-end nymphing rod because it isn't my favorite way to fish. Like I said, and I stand by my words, it's a very, very productive way to fish. It's just not my favorite way to fish. And so I didn't want to invest a lot of money in a nymphing rod. I'd rather spend a lot more money on my nice dry fly rod or my striper rod or something like that. And so I would say, how much do you need to spend for a good rod? My objective answer is $200 to $300, but of course you can go either way and do just fine based on your budget and on your needs. So these are some of the kinds of questions that I like to deal with and address in this article series and on this page, Fly Rod FAQs. I'll bring up one more because I think we have time for it, and isn't 7 feet or shorter too short for a good fly cast? Isn't 7 feet or shorter too short for a good fly cast? So I think my shortest fly rod might be 5'3". My shortest production rod. I have a couple of custom rods that are shorter than that. But people will often say, isn't that too short? You're not gonna be able to cast. That's really for just, flicking and bow and arrow casts and things like that. You can only use that when you're blue line. You can only use that for teeny tiny trout. Anything on a larger river, that's just not gonna work. Well, I can say both by anecdotal personal experience, prolonged personal experience with big fish, and from people who have fished much more than me and cast much further than I can, that's just not true. A 7-foot rod will do a lot for you. Now, kind of like what I was mentioning earlier, it might not be as easy and it might not be as fun to throw consistent long casts on big wide rivers with that 7-foot fly rod. But you can get it done. And if you are consistently under 50 feet in your casting, you probably are going to get it done just fine. I fished a 7-foot 3-weight almost exclusively for a number of years, probably from when I really started fly fishing up until I started working at a fly shop. So maybe 4 or 5 years, I fished a 7-foot 3-weight almost exclusively. I had a couple of other rods, but to me, they just felt like overkill for a lot of the fishing that I was doing. But I still took that 7-foot 3-weight on spring creeks and caught big, fat fish with it, and I took it out on bigger rivers and I made long casts with it. A lot of it has to do with your casting skill and your familiarity with casting a fly line on that particular rod and having the right line. So I would say, let me back off on that. If you buy that fly rod for fishing small brook trout creeks or little cutthroat creeks, and you buy a finesse delicate line that is meant to turn over flies at short distances for that kind of fishing, so a small creek line, then it isn't going to be as fun to throw those 50-foot casts when the time comes. But if you buy a general purpose line, and that is a rod that has a medium fast action, then you're going to be able to cast that 40-foot cast without an issue, especially if you're fishing lighter flies. Unweighted nymphs, small streamers, and of course dry flies. And so I would say that a 7-foot rod, even a 6-foot 9-inch rod, 7-foot 3-inch rod, maybe even shorter, you're going to be able to cast just fine if you have the right line and you have the right expectations, which is most normal trout fishing. And as I alluded to, and I mentioned this in this article, there's some casting records that have been set with these really, really short casting rods. And this was a long time ago that people were doing this. Today, it's just remarkable what a well-made 7-foot 3-weight or 4-weight can do. And honestly, I think a really valuable fishing rod to have in your arsenal, if you have multiple rods, is like a 7-foot 5-weight or 7.5-foot 5-weight. You can do a lot of stuff with that. It's a great streamer fishing tool. It is a great tool for fishing in difficult conditions. Because you have that power of that rod, but also you have the density of that fly line. And of course, one of the other questions on here is like, well, you're not going to feel the fish. That's baloney. You're going to feel the fish just fine. The difference between a 3-weight and a 5-weight, it's not that big of a deal. So those are 3 questions. I've probably got 15 or so on there right now. Maybe not that many, but of course more are going to be added on. I don't want to make this the shtick where I do one of these articles every week or even necessarily one a month, but I'm adding to it consistently because I get questions, and if I get the same question 3 or 4 times, or I'm like, this is a question I've got year after year, then I'm going to throw it on here just again to give a little bit of a sample of my answer. Feel free to email me or use the messaging tool at the bottom of that page or on castingacross.com to say, hey, can you elaborate? What do you mean by this? Or, you're wrong, completely wrong. Take that off of there. Let me know. I always love to hear that. Matthew at castingacross.com. And again, another word about Fly Rod FAQs here in a moment. But first, I want to talk about the article that came out first this week called In Memoriam Opening Day of Trout Season. So we had an opening day of trout season up here in the great state of New Hampshire, and that was for trout ponds, which is a big part of a lot of people's trout fishing up here in New Hampshire. But since January 1st, all the rivers and streams, generally speaking, have been open. And so what that's done, and other states I've lived in, we've had that same dynamic. It's kind of taken away some of the aura and the mystique and the tradition and a lot of that aspect of fly fishing of opening day. But it doesn't have to be that way. So in this article, I talk about the demise, but also the eulogy and the commemoration of opening day and how you can do both of those things. So check that article out. And then Wednesday's article was really what I was just talking about. It's called Even More Fly Rod FAQs. Even More Fly Rod FAQs. So I cover 5 more questions in that article. This week's recommendation on the podcast is you go to that article, you go to that page, Fly Rod FAQs, where you can see the whole list of Fly Rod FAQs, including the 3 that I mentioned today in the podcast. And I'll probably pick up on this theme and do more podcasts like this in the future because I enjoy it, and these generally get a pretty good response from listeners. But at the bottom of that page is a field, and above it says, have a fly rod question? Let me know in the box below. It's easier than sending an email. and you don't get added to a list unless you ask to be added to the list. But it gives me an opportunity to answer your specific question, whether it be a brand new question, whether it be a rephrasing of one of the questions I've already asked and answered, or whether it be a desire for elaboration on something I've said. I would love to hear from you, and I'd just love to hear more about fly rods. If you have a really cool fly rod, I'd love to know about that. I think that'd be a fun thing here in the future, is to talk about people's gear that they've either come across it, or they've lost it and found it again, or they've had a victorious battle with a fish. All that stuff is always very, very fun to hear, but also to share with others. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.
A life that has the stories to back it. A life to be proud of. It's a Winchester life.
Yeah, baby. 6'8" Western. Oh, mule deer, baby, right there.
Tune in every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern on Waypoint TV.